In the unforgiving heart of the 1884 Montana Territory, a lone woman's act of kindness alters the course of 2 lives forever. When Clara Hayes offers a plate of food to a weathered lost cowboy who appears at her fence line, she believes she is simply doing a good deed. She couldn't know the man Jedediah Stone is a walking storm of secrets, trailed by a past darker than a moonless prairie night. What begins as a place at her table soon becomes a battle for her home, her life and her heart, in a story of redemption, betrayal, and the violent price of love. The dust was a constant companion. It settled on the sills of Clara Hayes's small, sturdy cabin, clung to the hem of her calico dress, and painted the sky in hazy, muted tones of ochre and pale rose. It was a lonely kind of life, etched into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana Territory in the year of our Lord, 1884. The loneliness was a quiet ache, one she had learned to carry like the water pails from the creek each morning. It was heavy, but her shoulders were strong. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 3 years. A good man, a dreamer who saw a kingdom in this rugged land, but hadn't seen the rattlesnake that lay coiled in the shade of a cottonwood. Since then, Clara had managed the homestead alone. The 160 acres of prairie granted by the Homestead Act were both her sanctuary and her prison. The days were a litany of chores, tending the small vegetable garden, milking her single cow Buttercup, mending fences, and keeping the ever-present threat of predators, both 4-legged and 2-legged, at bay. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow, magnificent descent behind the jagged peaks of the distant Beartooth Mountains, when she saw him. He was a silhouette at first, a dark shape materializing out of the heat haze at the far edge of her property, where the wild plains met her stubbornly fenced pasture. He wasn't riding, but leading his horse, a big, weary-looking roan. The man's steps were a slow, deliberate shuffle, the gait of someone pushed past the point of exhaustion. Caution was a settler's most vital tool. Clara's hand instinctively went to the worn handle of the Winchester rifle she kept propped just inside the cabin door. She watched from the shadows of her porch as he approached the fence line. He stopped, leaning his forehead against the rough-hewn wood, his shoulders slumping. The horse nudged his back, a gentle, questioning gesture. He didn't make a move toward the cabin, didn't call out. He just stood there, a man at the end of his rope, seeking a moment's respite in the sliver of shade offered by a lone, struggling aspen she had planted in Thomas's memory. Curiosity warred with her deep-seated suspicion. Travelers were not uncommon, but most were families in prairie schooners or loud, boisterous cowboys from the cattle drives far to the south. This man was different. He radiated a profound stillness, a solitude that mirrored her own. For 10 minutes she watched. He sank to the ground, his back against the fence post, and pulled a canteen from his saddlebag, taking a long, slow swallow. He offered the canteen to his horse before taking another sip for himself. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. A man who cared for his beast before himself in such conditions was a man who understood the harsh calculus of survival. Against her better judgment, a thread of compassion unwound within her. Thomas had always said that a shared meal was a balm for the soul. You can't know a man's heart, he used to say, but you can fill his belly. Sometimes that's enough. Wiping her damp palms on her apron, Clara made a decision. She turned back into the dim, cool cabin. The air smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. A pot of rabbit stew seasoned with wild thyme and carrots from her garden simmered on the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was hot and nourishing. She ladled a generous portion into a tin bowl, grabbed a thick slice of cornbread she'd baked that morning, and filled a jug with fresh, cool water from the well. With the rifle now cradled in the crook of her other arm, she stepped back out into the fading light. The man hadn't moved. His head was tilted back, his hat shielding his face. He might have been asleep or worse. "Hello," she called out, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the tremor in her heart. The man's head snapped up. He scrambled to his feet with a surprising swiftness, his hand flying to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a stormy sky, startlingly blue in a face caked with dust and etched with lines of hardship that went far beyond his years. He looked to be around 30, but his eyes held the weariness of a man twice that age. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, as if it hadn't been used in days. "Didn't mean to trespass, just needed a moment. My horse, she's thrown a shoe." Clara stopped a safe distance away, about 20 feet. She could see him more clearly now. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his dusty shirt. A dark, unruly mess of hair spilled from under his hat, and a scruff of a beard covered his jaw, unable to hide the sharp, handsome angles of his face. But it was the tension in him that she noted most, a coiled spring, ready to react to the slightest threat. "This land ain't got no room for trespassers," she stated plainly, letting the barrel of the Winchester remain visible. "But it's got room for a man who's thirsty." She nodded toward the offering in her hands. "I've got stew and water. You look like you could use both." He stared at the bowl, then back at her, his stormy eyes searching her face. It was a look of profound disbelief, as if kindness were a foreign language he had long forgotten. For a moment she thought he would refuse, that his pride or his suspicion would send him on his way. Then slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt and laid it carefully on the ground. It was a gesture of trust, a clear and unequivocal surrender. "I'd be mighty grateful, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now. "Mighty grateful indeed." She walked the remaining distance and passed the bowl and the jug over the fence. His fingers brushed against hers as he took them, his touch rough and calloused, yet surprisingly gentle. He sank back to the ground, placing the bowl carefully beside him, and first drank deeply from the water jug. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a man pulling back from the brink. He ate the stew with a ravenous hunger, yet with a strange sort of dignity, as if forcing himself to maintain some semblance of manners. He didn't speak, and Clara didn't press him. She remained where she was, leaning against the fence, her rifle held loosely in her hands. The silence, stretched between them comfortable, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the soft whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. When he was finished, he scraped the last of the stew from the bowl with the cornbread, and ate that too. He looked at the empty bowl in his hands, as if it were a precious artifact. "I ain't had a home-cooked meal in—" I can't remember how long, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. He looked up at her, and the setting sun caught his eyes, turning them the color of a twilight sky. "My name is Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed." "Clara Hayes," she replied. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, a respectful nod. "I'm in your debt." "A meal ain't a debt," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It's just a meal. You said your horse threw a shoe. I don't have a forge, but I've got a small anvil and some tools in the barn. My husband, he was good with his hands. Maybe I can help." Jedediah looked from her to the small, sturdy barn, then back again. The suspicion in his eyes was still there, a flickering ember, but it was being slowly banked by a cautious curiosity. "You'd do that?" "For a stranger, I'd do it for the horse," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips for the first time. "No animal deserves to suffer on account of a bad road." He studied her for a long moment, a silent, intense appraisal that made her feel as if he were looking not just at her, but through her into the lonely corners of her heart. Then he gave a slow, tired nod. "All right, Mrs. Hayes," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "All right." As she led him and his horse toward the barn, the last sliver of sun disappeared, plunging the homestead into the deep, velvety purple of twilight. She lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the encroaching darkness, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the barn didn't feel quite so empty. She didn't know then that she had just invited a storm into her quiet world. She didn't know the name Jedediah Stone was a whisper in dusty saloons and a curse on the lips of powerful men. She only knew that she had given a lost cowboy a place at her table. She could never have imagined that in return he would one day offer her everything he had left to give his last name. The barn was a world of its own, cocooned in the deep, resonant silence of the prairie night. The lantern light was a living thing, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar shapes of hay bales and stacked tools seem mysterious and new. The air was thick with the scent of dry hay, old leather, and the earthy smell of the horse. But another sharper aroma soon joined them, the acrid bite of hot metal and coal smoke. Jedediah had stripped off his dusty outer shirt, revealing a sweat-dampened undershirt that clung to the hard lines of his back and shoulders. He moved with an economy of motion that belied his apparent exhaustion, stoking the small, seldom-used forge in the corner until the coals glowed like a dragon's eye. Clara stood in the wide-open doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. The Winchester still held loosely in one hand. She told herself she was standing guard, that it was simple prudence to watch a strange man on her property. But it was more than that. She was mesmerized. He worked with a focused intensity that seemed to block out the rest of the world. After examining the roan's hoof with a gentle practiced touch, he found the old shoe warped but intact in his saddlebag. Using Thomas's tools, he began the laborious process of reshaping it. The barn filled with a rhythmic, percussive symphony. The asthmatic wheeze of the bellows, the sharp clang of his hammer striking the glowing metal on the anvil, the angry hiss as he plunged the shoe into a bucket of water. Each strike of the hammer sent a shower of orange sparks into the gloom, momentarily illuminating the taut muscles of his arms and the focused, grim set of his jaw. There were scars on his arms, she noticed, faint white lines that crisscrossed his tanned skin. The ghosts of old battles with men or with the wild. A particularly jagged one, near his left elbow, looked like it came from a knife. Her fingers tightened on her rifle. "You handle a hammer like you were born to it," she said, her voice cutting through the ringing of the anvil. He didn't stop his work, but his rhythm faltered for a fraction of a second. "My father was a blacksmith," he said, his voice tight with effort as he lifted the heavy hammer again. Clang, clang, clang. Back in Ohio, a lifetime ago. Ohio, she repeated softly. It sounded impossibly far away. A place of green hills and civilization, the very opposite of this raw, sun-bleached land. "What brought you so far west?" He stopped, resting the hammer on the anvil and turning to face her. The glow from the forge painted one side of his face in fiery light, leaving the other in deep shadow. His blue eyes seemed to smolder in the darkness. He wiped a trickle of sweat from his temple with the back of a sooty wrist. "Looking for something, I suppose," he said, his voice low and evasive. "Aren't we all? Some of us are just trying to hold on to what we've got," she countered, her gaze sweeping over the dark expanse of her land beyond the lantern's glow. A flicker of something regret, perhaps, or a deep, abiding sadness passed through his eyes. "That's the harder fight, ma'am. Anyone can run. It takes a different kind of strength to stand your ground." He looked directly at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You've got that kind of strength. I saw it the moment you stepped off that porch." Her breath caught in her throat. No one had spoken of her strength since Thomas died. The townsfolk in Miles City, a 2-day ride away, treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The poor widow Hayes too stubborn or too foolish to sell her claim and move back east where a woman belonged. To have this stranger, this man of shadows and secrets, see her so clearly was both unnerving and deeply unexpectedly validating. He turned back to his work, and the spell was broken. Clara forced herself to breathe the air, feeling thick and heavy in her lungs. She watched his hands, strong and capable, as he deftly finished shaping the shoe. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation. This was a man who knew how to create, how to mend. It was a stark contrast to the destructive purpose of the gun he had laid aside so readily. Which man was he? The mender or the breaker? After cooling the shoe a final time, he carried it over to the horse. He spoke to the animal in a low, soothing murmur, and the big roan, which had been skittish and nervous, calmed instantly under his touch. He lifted the hoof, cleaned it, and with a series of precise, sharp taps, nailed the shoe into place. He ran his hand over the finished work, nodding to himself in satisfaction. "That'll hold you till we get to a proper town girl," he whispered to the horse, giving her a fond pat on the neck. He stood and turned to Clara, rolling his shoulders to work out the kinks. "The debt is paid, Mrs. Hayes. Thank you for the use of your tools, and for the meal. We'll be out of your hair before sunrise." The thought of the barn falling silent again, of the homestead, returning to its hollow emptiness, sent a sharp, unwelcome pang through her. The loneliness she had grown accustomed to suddenly felt acute, unbearable. "The sun is down," she said, her voice more firm than she felt. "There's predators out there, and the trail is treacherous in the dark. It'd be foolish to travel by night." She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You can sleep in the barn. There's clean hay in the loft. It's warm enough." Jedediah stared at her, his face a mask of weary surprise. The suspicion returned to his eyes, warring with a desperate longing for rest. "Why? You don't know me from Adam. I know you're good to your horse," she said, repeating her earlier sentiment. It felt like a flimsy excuse even to her own ears. The truth was far more complicated. She wasn't ready for him to leave. His presence, as unsettling as it was, had pushed back the crushing weight of her solitude in a way she hadn't realized was possible, and she added, gesturing with the rifle, "I know that if you mean me any harm, you'll have to come through that door, and I'll be sitting on the other side of it." A slow, wry smile touched his lips, transforming his hard, bitten face. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it did strange things to her composure. "Fair enough, Mrs. Hayes. A man would be a fool to argue with a woman holding a Winchester, and a sound argument." He walked over to the fence post where he'd left his gun belt. He picked it up not with the swagger of a gunslinger, but with the weary resignation of a man shackled to a heavy burden. He didn't strap it on. He carried it with him as he climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the leather creaking in the quiet barn. Clara waited until she heard him settle into the hay, a soft rustling, followed by a profound silence. She took a deep, shaky breath and backed out of the barn, pulling the heavy door closed. It didn't have a lock, only a simple wooden latch. It was a flimsy barrier against a man like that, but she knew with a certainty that defied logic that the real barrier was the unspoken code of honor that had passed between them. He had surrendered his gun. She had offered him sanctuary. For tonight, a truce had been declared. As she walked back to the cabin, the moon had risen, bathing the prairie in a soft, ethereal silver light. The world looked beautiful but fragile, as if it were made of glass. She latched the cabin door behind her, the familiar sound doing little to soothe her racing heart. She sat in her rocking chair by the cold hearth, the Winchester laid across her lap, and listened to the sounds of the night. But she wasn't listening for coyotes anymore. She was listening for the stirring of the stranger in her barn, the man who had hammered his way into her quiet life, leaving the echo of his presence ringing in the silence. Clara slept in fits and starts, seated in her rocking chair, with the rifle across her lap. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind in the eaves, sent a jolt through her. She was listening for a footstep that never came. When the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the sky, she finally rose, her body stiff, and her mind clouded with an exhaustion that had little to do with lack of sleep. She expected to look out her window and see Jedediah and his roan disappearing over the horizon. Instead, she saw him by the woodpile, his back to her, the borrowed axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. He had already chopped a considerable amount of firewood, stacking it neatly against the cabin wall. The crisp morning air rang with the clean, sharp sound of splitting wood. Her hand went to the door latch, her mind a whirl of confusion and suspicion. Why was he still here? Was this some kind of trick, a way to make her lower her guard? She unlatched the door and stepped out onto the porch, her movements stiff. The cool air was a welcome balm on her face. He must have heard her, because he stopped planting the axe head in the chopping block. He turned, and for a moment in the soft morning light, he looked different. The haunted, hunted look in his eyes had receded, replaced by a simple, quiet weariness. He had washed his face at the water pump. Droplets of water clung to his beard and hair, glinting like tiny diamonds. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Figured the least I could do is earn last night's keep." "I didn't ask for payment," she said, her voice betraying a slight quaver. She despised. "No, you didn't." He agreed, his gaze steady. "That's why it needs giving." He gestured with his chin toward the coffee pot she had left on the embers of her hearth fire. "Smells like you got coffee on. I'd trade a stack of firewood for a cup of that, if the offer stands." Something inside her, a knot of fear and caution she had been holding tight for 3 years, loosened just a fraction. This was a language she understood, the simple, honest currency of work. A man who offered a day's labor for a cup of coffee was a man playing by a set of rules she recognized. She nodded curtly and went back inside to fetch a second tin cup. When she returned, he was waiting on the porch steps, having left the axe by the woodpile. She poured the steaming, bitter coffee into the 2 cups and handed one to him. Their fingers brushed again, a fleeting contact that was somehow more intimate in the clear light of day. She sat in her rocking chair. He remained on the steps, cradling the warm cup in his hands as if it were a fragile bird. They drank in silence for a time, watching the prairie awaken. The sun climbed higher, burning the morning mist off the grasslands and setting the world ablaze with color. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt shared. "That fence on your northern pasture is down in 3 places," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Cattle could wander off, or wolves could wander in." She sighed. "I know. I was meaning to get to it this week. It's hard to find the time for everything." "2 hands make for light work," he said simply. He finished his coffee and stood up. "You provide the wire and staples, Mrs. Hayes, and I'll provide the back." And so began the strangest day of Clara's life. She worked alongside this enigmatic stranger, a man whose last name was likely an alias and whose past was a locked box. Yet under the vast open sky, he was simply Jed, a man with strong hands and a quiet competence that was both reassuring and deeply compelling. He didn't just fix the fence, he improved it, sinking the posts deeper, stretching the wire tighter than Thomas ever had. He moved with a purpose and skill that spoke of a life spent in hard physical labor. As they worked, the distance between them began to shrink. They spoke of simple things: the weather, the stubbornness of cattle, the best way to mend a broken tool. He told her a funny, self-deprecating story about his first and only attempt at panning for gold, which ended with him falling into an icy river and losing his pan. She found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. In turn, she told him about Thomas, about his dreams for this land, her voice soft with a grief that had finally lost its sharpest edges. He listened intently, his gaze full of a compassion that asked for nothing in return. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on them when Clara first saw it. A rider, a speck in the far distance to the west, coming not from the direction of the town, but from the untamed wilderness. She paused, her hand shading her eyes. Jed, who had been tightening a wire, went utterly still. The easy camaraderie of the morning vanished in an instant, replaced by the coiled tension she had seen the day before. His body became a rigid line of vigilance, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the distant figure. His hand instinctively dropped to his hip, his fingers flexing around empty air where his gun belt should have been. "Who do you know from that direction?" he asked, his voice low and hard, all traces of warmth gone. "No one," she said, her own heart beginning to beat faster. "Trappers sometimes, but they usually keep to the mountains this time of year." The rider was not heading directly for them. He seemed to be moving parallel to their property line, a dark, lonely figure against the immense landscape. He was too far away to make out any details, but his purpose felt clear. He was observing, scouting. "Jed," she asked, a thread of fear weaving into her voice. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He just watched, his jaw tight, until the rider, after several long minutes, turned his horse and disappeared back into the folds of the rolling hills from whence he came. Only then did Jed seem to breathe again, a long, slow exhalation of tightly held air. He turned to her, and the hunted look was back more intense than ever. "Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both intimate and alarming. "You're a good woman. You've shown me a kindness I haven't known in a long, long time. And for that, I'm putting you in danger." "Danger? What are you talking about? Who was that?" "He's a scout," Jed said, his voice grim. "He's not looking for trappers. He's looking for me. He picked up the hammer. He'd been using his knuckles white. I should have left this morning. I was selfish to stay. A cold dread washed over Clara, but it was quickly followed by a hot surge of defiance. This was her land, her home. She had fought tooth and nail to keep it against nature, against loneliness, against the pitying whispers of the world. She would not be scared off it by a shadow on the horizon. "I'm not afraid," she said, and was surprised to find that it was mostly true. "You should be," he said, his voice raw. "You don't know the men who are looking for me. You don't know what they're capable of." "Then tell me," she demanded, stepping closer to him, her chin lifted. "Tell me who you are, Jedediah Stone. Tell me who sends scouts to watch you from a distance." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a terrible conflict, a desire to protect her, warring with the knowledge that he had already failed. He looked at the home she had carved out of the wilderness, at the sturdy cabin, and the mended fence, and a deep, profound guilt settled over his features. "His name is Silas Blackwood," Jed said, and the name fell between them like a stone into a deep well. "And he will burn this whole world to the ground to get what he wants." He looked her straight in the eye, his own gaze bleak. "And right now, Mrs. Hayes, he wants me." The name Silas Blackwood hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the gathering clouds on the western horizon. Clara knew the name. Everyone in the Montana Territory knew it. It was a name spoken in hushed, fearful tones in the saloons of Miles City, and whispered in the general stores where homesteaders bought their meager supplies. Blackwood wasn't just a cattle baron. He was an empire builder, a man who saw the vast, untamed land not as a place for homes and families, but as a personal kingdom to be conquered and controlled. His Bar B ranch was a sprawling behemoth that swallowed smaller claims like a hungry snake, and his methods were known to be as ruthless and unforgiving as a prairie blizzard. To hear that this man, this distant, almost mythical figure of power and cruelty, was hunting the quiet, capable man standing before her, sent a tremor of real fear through Clara. The vague threat on the horizon now had a face, and it was a terrifying one. Silas Blackwood. She breathed the words, tasting like ash. What could you have possibly done to get on the wrong side of a man like that? Jed's face was a stone mask, but his eyes were turbulent, a storm of guilt and regret. He turned away from her, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's not what I've done. It's what he thinks I've done." He kicked at a clump of dry earth. "He thinks I stole from him." "And did you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. She had to know. He turned back to her, his jaw set. "Yes," he said, the admission raw and sharp, "but not what he thinks, not for the reasons he imagines." The sky was darkening rapidly now, the clouds rolling in, thick and bruised-looking. A sudden cold wind whipped across the prairie, rustling the grass and kicking up dust. It carried the scent of rain and a palpable sense of foreboding. The first fat drops began to fall, splatting against the dry ground. "We need to get inside," Clara said, her practical nature taking over. "The storm is coming." They gathered the tools in a tense silence and hurried back toward the cabin as the heavens opened up. The rain came down in a torrent, a driving, blinding sheet of water that soaked them both to the skin in seconds. They stumbled onto the porch, gasping, and pushed their way into the relative quiet of the cabin, slamming the door against the howling wind and the roar of the downpour. inside the world shrank to the four walls of the small room. The light from the single window was dim and grey, and the cabin was filled with a deep twilight gloom. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and water, effectively trapping them, forcing a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Clara shivered as much from tension as from the cold. She lit a lantern, its steady golden light a small act of defiance against the chaos outside. It cast flickering shadows on Jed's face as he stood dripping on the floorboards, his shoulders slumped, looking utterly defeated. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the storm. "When they come back, they won't be scouting. Blackwood doesn't give second chances. He'll send his men, and they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire. They'll tear this place apart to find me. And where will you go?" she challenged, her voice rising. "Back out into that. You wouldn't last the night. You'd be riding straight into their arms. It's my fight, Clara, not yours." He shot back, his frustration boiling over. "I never should have stopped here. I never should have brought this to your door." "But you did," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low intensity. She stepped toward him until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to see the exhaustion and fear etched into the lines around his eyes. "You are here, and Blackwood's man saw you here. Leaving now doesn't protect me. It just leaves me here alone to face his questions when he comes looking. My fate is tied to yours now, whether you like it or not. So you will stop talking about running, and you will start talking to me. Tell me the truth, Jed. The whole truth." He stared down at her, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He looked from her determined face to the sturdy walls of her home, the sanctuary he had so carelessly violated. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He sank onto the small bench by the table and buried his face in his hands. "He thinks I stole a map," he said, his voice muffled. "A map to a silver strike, deep in the Bighorn Mountains. Enough silver to make a man a king. And did you?" He lifted his head, and his eyes were haunted. "The map was given to me." He paused, and the next words came out, laced with a pain so deep it made her ache to hear it. "It was given to me by his wife, Isabel." The name fell into the charged silence, and with it came a dawning, terrible understanding. This wasn't about money. Not really. Isabel Blackwood was a prisoner in her own home. Jed continued, his voice low and strained. Blackwood paraded her around like a prized mare, but behind closed doors. He was a monster. I was working a cattle drive that shared a border with his land. I saw her a few times. I saw the bruises she tried to hide. I saw the terror in her eyes. He looked away, staring into the flickering lantern flame, as if reliving the memory. She was from back east, a gentle soul not meant for this country, and certainly not for a man like him. She planned to run. She'd found the map among her husband's papers. She didn't care about the silver. She saw it as a weapon to use against him, a way to ruin him, to buy her freedom. She stitched it into the lining of a coat. She asked me for help, just to get her to the train station in Cheyenne. That's all. What happened to her? Clara whispered, her heart clenching in dread. Jed's face crumpled. I went to meet her at the agreed time at an old line shack on the edge of his property. But I was too late. Blackwood must have found out. He was there. She wasn't. There was a struggle. Her locket, one I'd seen her wear, was on the ground, the chain broken. He took a shuddering breath, He thinks she ran off with me, that we were lovers, that we stole his map to finance a life together. He put a bounty on my head. $5,000 for the map and for me, dead or alive. The full, horrifying weight of the story settled over Clara. Jedediah wasn't a thief. He was a witness. He was the only person left who knew Blackwood was not just a brute, but likely a murderer. He wasn't running from justice. He was running from a man who owned justice in this part of the country. The choice was laid bare before her, as stark and unforgiving as the landscape outside her door. She could force him out into the storm, wash her hands of this bloody affair, and pray that Blackwood would believe her story. Or she could stand with him. She could shelter this broken, honorable man, and in doing so declare war on the most powerful man in the territory. She looked at him, at the guilt and grief that threatened to swallow him whole. She saw the man who gave water to his horse before himself, who chopped wood to pay for coffee, who spoke of a woman's strength with reverence. Her own defiance, the same stubborn grit that had kept her on this land for 3 years, rose up in her fierce and undeniable. Thomas had built this home with his hands, and she had protected it with her spirit. It was a place of sanctuary. It would not be a place of surrender. The storm outside seemed to lessen its fury, its roar softening to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The crisis had passed, leaving a quiet resolve in its wake. Clara walked to the hearth and picked up the coffee pot. Her hands were perfectly steady. She poured what was left of the coffee into his cup and pushed it across the table toward him. He looked up at her, his eyes questioning, vulnerable. "Drink your coffee, Jedediah," she said, her voice calm and clear. "You look like you could use it." She went to the window and stared out at the rain-washed world. "When the sun comes up, we'll see what the day brings us some. But tonight, you are not a stranger in my barn. You are a guest in my home." It was a declaration, a promise. He hadn't just given her his name. He had given her his story, his trust. And in return, she had just given him a chance. She had chosen to close the door on the storm, but to stand with the man she had let inside. The world after the storm was scrubbed clean, raw, and glistening. The morning sun broke through the retreating clouds, setting the rain-soaked prairie ablaze and making every blade of grass, every pebble, stand out in sharp relief. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. The rage of the storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that was both a reprieve and a warning. Jedediah had not slept in the rocking chair, as she'd half expected. At some point in the night, she had found him a spare blanket, and he had made a bed on the floor by the hearth, a silent sentinel guarding the door. Clara had woken in her own bed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The weight of the rifle replaced by a different, heavier burden, the weight of knowledge. They moved around the small cabin in a quiet, synchronized orbit, the space between them charged with unspoken things. He refilled the wood box with the wood he'd chopped. She cooked bacon and eggs, the familiar sizzle, a comforting sound in the tense silence. They ate at the small table, their eyes meeting occasionally over their tin plates. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a man with a story, a burden she now implicitly shared. And she was no longer just a charitable widow. She was his sanctuary, his accomplice, his only ally. It was Jedediah who saw them first. He was standing by the window, staring out at the vast open land his coffee cup held forgotten in his hand. His body went rigid, the same sudden, sharp tension she'd seen when he'd spotted the scout. "They're here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the window and peered over his shoulder. 3 riders. They were moving at a steady, unhurried pace, not like men in a rush, but like men who knew their destination and were confident of their reception. They rode abreast, a solid, menacing line against the bright morning sky. Even from a distance, they radiated a cold, lethal purpose. "Get the rifle," Jed said, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. "Stay away from the door." He moved quickly, his earlier weariness burned away by a surge of adrenaline. He checked the simple latch on the door, then moved to the barn where he had left his gun belt. He returned a moment later, the Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip. The sight of it transformed him once again. He was no longer Jed the quiet handyman. He was Jedediah Stone, the fugitive, the man worth $5,000. "This is my fight, Clara," he said, his back to her. "When they call me out, you stay put. You don't know me. I'm just a drifter who forced his way in. You tell them that." "No," she said, her voice shaking, but resolute. She moved to stand beside him, the Winchester clutched in her hands. Its weight was familiar, comforting. "They saw your horse in my barn. They saw us working on the fence line. They won't believe it. This is my home, Jedediah. I don't run from a fight on my own land." He turned to look at her, a fierce, desperate light in his eyes. He saw not fear, but a stubborn, unyielding strength that mirrored the very landscape she refused to abandon. He saw the woman who had faced him down with a rifle and then offered him a meal. He knew in that moment that arguing with her was as pointless as arguing with the turning of the seasons. The riders were closer now, close enough for their features to become clear. The man in the middle was thick-set with a cruel, downturned mouth and a black bowler hat pulled low on his brow. He was flanked by 2 leaner, younger men, their faces hard and emotionless. They carried their rifles with a casual ease that spoke a constant familiar use. They stopped just beyond the mended fence line, about 50 yards from the cabin. Jedediah Stone, the man in the bowler hat, called out his voice, a gravelly bark that carried easily in the clear air. "Silas Blackwood sends his regards. He's got a business proposition for you. Come on out so we can talk." Jed glanced at Clara. His mind was racing. A straight shootout was suicide. 3 of them, one of him, and she would be caught in the middle. He needed a different weapon. The truth. He looked at the coat hanging by the door, the one Isabel had supposedly stitched the map into. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form. "The map," he said in a low voice to Clara. "That's all he really wants. He thinks I have it." "Do you?" she whispered. He shook his head. "I never saw it. But he doesn't know that." He looked back at the men. "I'm going out there. They'll shoot you on sight." "Not if they think I have what they want," he countered. "Buy me time. When I give you a signal, you do exactly as I say." Before she could protest further, he took a deep breath, unlatched the door, and stepped out onto the porch, his hands held high and away from his gun. "That's close enough, Fletcher," Jed called out, his voice steady. "I know who you are, and I know Blackwood didn't send you all this way, just to talk." The man named Fletcher let a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Smart man, Stone. The boss wants the map. Give it to us, and maybe we can be persuaded to let the lady live." He gestured with his rifle toward the cabin, a clear, vile threat. "The lady has nothing to do with this," Jed said, taking a slow step forward. The The map is safe. But you're not getting it. Not until I get some assurances. The only assurance you're getting is a quick death instead of a slow one." Fletcher sneered. "Is that the same assurance you gave Isabel?" Jed called back, his voice ringing with accusation. Fletcher's smile faltered. The two men beside him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting from Jed to their boss. "She was a thief and a whore," Fletcher spat. "She got what she deserved. She was a terrified woman, trying to escape a monster." Jed's voice rose, filled with a righteous fury. "And you helped him kill her. Did he tell you that part? Did he tell you that you're not just chasing a thief? You're burying a secret. His secret." This was the signal. From inside the cabin, Clara acted. She didn't run or hide. She did something they would never expect. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, not with the rifle, but with the coffee pot from the stove. "Would you gentlemen care for some coffee?" she asked, her voice impossibly calm, imbued with the simple, unassailable authority of a woman in her own home. "It's a long ride back to the Bar B." The three men stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. Their brutal, violent script had been interrupted by an offer of common courtesy. It was so absurd, so out of place, that it momentarily broke their focus. And in that moment of hesitation, Jedediah acted. With a speed that defied belief, his hand dropped to his Colt. The gun cleared the holster in a single fluid motion. Bang! The first shot kicked up dirt right in front of Fletcher's horse, sending the animal rearing back in panic. Bang! The second shot ripped through the hat of the rider on the right, sending it spinning into the air. "Drop them!" Jed roared, his face a mask of cold fury. "Drop the rifles now." The two younger men, their nerve broken, let their rifles clatter to the ground. Fletcher, fighting his spooked horse, wrestled his own weapon, his face purple with rage. He was a bully, not a gunman, and Jed's display of superior speed and accuracy had shattered his confidence. "It's over, Fletcher," Jed said, his voice deadly calm. The Colt aimed steady as a rock at the man's chest. "You can die here for a man who's using you to cover a murder, or you can ride out and tell Blackwood his secret is out. Tell him the next time we meet, it won't be with his hired thugs. It'll be with the law. A real U.S. Marshal who might be interested to hear about what really happened to his wife." Fletcher stared down the barrel of the gun, then at the determined woman standing on the porch, and finally at his two disarmed men. He was beaten. The story, the accusation about Isabel, had been a more powerful weapon than any bullet. It had planted a seed of doubt, a poison that would travel all the way back to the Bar B. He spat on the ground, his face a mask of hatred. "This ain't over, Stone. It is for you," Jed said. "Now get off this land." Fletcher wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his two men scrambling to retrieve their rifles before following in a clumsy, panicked retreat. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. Clara felt the strength drain from her legs and sank into her rocking chair, the empty coffee pot still clutched in her hand. Jedediah stood for a long moment, watching them disappear, before he finally holstered his gun and turned toward to her. The look on his face was one of profound relief, mixed with an even more profound sorrow. "They'll be back," he said softly. "Not them, but him. Blackwood himself." "I know," she whispered. He walked over to the porch and sat on the steps, his head in his hands. "I have to leave Clara, now. I'll draw him away from here. He wants me, not you. The thought of the silence returning, of the emptiness, was more terrifying than the threat of Silas Blackwood. She looked at her home, the sturdy cabin, the mended fence, the garden, and realized it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. Her quiet life was over whether Jed stayed or went. She stood up and walked over to stand behind him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said. He looked up at her, confused. "No, you're right." "This isn't my fight," she said, her voice gathering strength. "But it is my life, and you are part of it now. My home is no longer safe because of you, so the only safety I have left is with you." She looked out at the vast open prairie, at the endless horizon. "This land, it's just dirt, Jedediah. For 3 years I thought it was everything, but it's not. It's just a place to be lonely." He rose to his feet, turning to face her. He stared at her, his stormy eyes filled with a dawning, wondrous disbelief. "You would leave all this for me?" "I'm not leaving it for you," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I'm choosing you over it." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. All the hardness, all the fight, fell away from his face, leaving only a raw, breathtaking vulnerability. He saw a future in her eyes, not of peace but of purpose. He saw a partner, an equal, a woman who did not run from a storm, but stood tall and faced it with him. "I can't offer you a home, Clara Hayes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't offer you peace or safety. The only thing I have left in this world to give anyone is my name." He took a shaky breath, his heart laid bare in his eyes. "It's not much of an offer. It comes with a whole world of trouble. But it's yours if you'll have it." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so fierce and profound it stole her breath. She thought of the lonely years, of the quiet ache that had been her constant companion, and she looked at the man before her, a man who had come to her as a lost cowboy, a shadow at her fence line. "Jedediah Stone," she said, testing the sound of the name of her future. "I think it's a fine name." He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight as if she were the only anchor in a turbulent sea. They stood there for a long time on the porch of the small cabin, two lonely souls who had found each other at the edge of the world. An hour later they rode away. Clara in her most durable dress, and Thomas's old riding coat on her own sturdy mare, and Jed on his roan. They didn't look back. The cabin, the fences, the small garden, they left it all behind for the prairie to reclaim. They rode east towards the rising sun, towards an uncertain future where Silas Blackwood was still a threat, and a real life was a dream yet to be forged. But they were not running from something anymore. They were riding toward everything together. He had come to her looking for a meal and a moment's rest, and she had given him a place at her table. In return, he had given her his last name, and with it a new beginning. The story of Clara and Jedediah doesn't end with a sunset, but with a new dawn as uncertain and as promising as the wild frontier itself. Theirs is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards, and that true sanctuary isn't a place, but a person. If their journey from strangers to partners in a fight for survival touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What did you think of Clara's final choice? Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the story, and share it with someone who appreciates a tale of courage, love, and redemption. Most importantly, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the heart of the Old West. Thank you for listening.